Kyron's nostrils filled with the noxious smell of death, a sign that more dolls were near. His stomach churned as he reached for his helmet and axe, then donned them both. In the pale moonlight, he saw the bloody carnage of Sanaq, each splatter seeming to sparkle. He quickly surveyed the area, eventually seeing the first doll. It had seen him as well. "Please!" The creature stumbled to the ground, its legs thrashing in an attempt to get closer to its prey. Its body was covered in inky blackness, with glimpses of bright red muscle and blood seeping through. In the light of the moon, the dolls were almost invisible, if not for their eyes that glowed brightly like beacons in the night. Sunlight would be too much to bear for anyone who laid eyes on one of these creatures. Kyron felt his stomach lurch as the doll got closer. Through the decay and rot, he could make out the shape of what used to be a woman. She had once been the proud owner of the best bakery in the land. Kyron's arm trembled as he gripped the handle of his double axe. He brought the blade down upon the woman's hip with a single, swift strike. She split in two, the scene feeling uncomfortably familiar to him. He stood there in his armor, his gaze lowered towards her corpse. He was quiet for a moment, reflecting on what had just occurred. He wished he could remember. "Leave her alone, you traitor!" Kyron jolted awake in surprise when something crashed against the back of his helmet. He whipped around, brandishing his axe as he searched for the source of the sound. He saw nothing. Glancing over his shoulder, Kyron spotted a figure in tattered clothing. In their hands they held a large slingshot, a sheath by their side, but with no sword within. Astonishingly, Kyron had overlooked the individual. "Are there any survivors?" The man's body trembled as he gaped up at Kyron, struggling to stuff another rock into his weapon. Tears spilled down his flushed face, creating a cascade that fell from his chin. It is not advisable to shorten or edit text without understanding the context. Why would you do this? Kyron was taken aback, unable to believe what he was hearing. His defensive stance weakened, leaving him utterly speechless. Did I do this? He caught sight of the young man's ribcage with a small hole in it, surrounded by dried ruby-red blood. There was no doubt he had been stabbed. Despite the injury, the man showed no indication of feeling any pain. His expression was one of disgust. A sense of déjà vu weighed heavily in the air. Kyron heard a chorus of gurgles and howls erupting into the night sky, coming from the mouths of dolls. He quickly turned around to find 4 more of the creatures slinking towards him. In that moment, the man he had been talking to was gone. Knowing there was no time to get emotional, Kyron drew his weapon before sheathing it and quickly taking off through the remains of the kingdom. He headed straight for the royal castle, where he was certain Elizabeth would be waiting for him. He had to make it there if he wanted to put an end to the madness. Kyron marched proudly along the road, his metal boots making a rhythmic clang that echoed through the night. He was part of a mighty army, headed for the castle moats of the Kingdom of Sanaq, a beautiful masterpiece of a place he had not visited in some time. But now, darkness lay heavy on the land, masking the destruction Elizabeth had caused. The drawbridge was desecrated, a giant mass of oak blown off its hinges and left forever open to invaders. As Kyron crossed the bridge, the moonlight illuminated the walls of the castle, revealing burn marks from where a massive chain had once held the wooden bridge to the mechanic crank. The use of sorcery was evident. He drew his weapon as he ran underneath the final gate into the castle grounds, but he was stopped in his tracks when a hand slammed down onto his armor's shoulder spike. Second Lieutenant Doone was a prominent figure in the army. He was highly respected and admired by his peers for his exemplary leadership and dedication to his duty. He was a source of inspiration for those around him, and a reminder of the importance of taking pride in one's work. Kyron spun around, his eyes widening in surprise. It is not possible to be alive. Kyron stood eye to eye with a warrior wearing a gleaming armor. In the center of the warrior's chest piece was a mess of flesh and metal, warped into a slash wound. Kyron knew this was once the spot where many medals were pinned, medals the captain of the Royal Army had earned before his fall years ago. A soft smile was on the warrior's face. You no longer seem to be under the spell. I can tell from the look in your eyes. The captain's smile stayed on his face as his gaze lingered on Kyron's soul. A tear slowly made its way down the captain's face. Kyron was speechless, feeling like this had already happened before. The captain's body faded away, glimmering in the night's starlight. Desperate, Kyron reached out for his comrade, but the only thing he felt was empty air. Please explain to me what occurred. What actions have I taken that have resulted in this situation? Kyron's thoughts wandered, unable to find a response. He had not seen his leader's face in a long time, and the sight of it stirred something inside of him. He suddenly realized that he was responsible for Sanaq's destruction. A feeling of guilt and remorse began to overwhelm him, rendering him immobile. The captain's words resonated in his mind. "You are now liberated from the magical spell." He hadn't done it entirely of his own volition. He had been taken over by an unseen force, a power so great that only one individual could be responsible for its might. Kyron sped into the castle grounds and took in the scenery. All around him were wooden dummies, swaying in the breeze like the grass beneath them. This was the training ground, where he and his soldiers had spent countless hours honing their skills. Even after all this time, the memory of them charging these mannequins would bring a smile to Kyron's face. He was grateful not to remember what he must have done to them. Kyron's nostrils flared as the familiar wave of nostalgia washed over him. Suddenly, he heard a creak behind him. Whipping around, he saw a doll crouched behind one of the dummies. Before he could take action, the doll launched itself forward and knocked him to the ground. Its limbs flailed wildly as it ripped a piece of Kyron's armor off, taking a chunk of his flesh with it. Kyron sucked in a breath and bore the pain as he righted himself and yanked the doll off of him, sending it crashing to the ground. He frantically searched for his axe and spotted it a few feet away, its handle standing out against the grass. Kyron lunged forward and grabbed the weapon just as the doll regained its footing and started lumbering towards him. His grip tight on the handle, Kyron stood and heard its battle cry. The fierce roar echoed through the air. Kyron readied himself for battle again, gripping his axe tightly and preparing to swing. But then he noticed the doll's gaping stab wound and the empty sword sheath next to her. Her expression of terror jolted his memory, and he suddenly remembered the young man he'd seen earlier. It was then that Kyron realized he had killed him. Elizabeth had taken his soul. His warrior instincts abandoned him, and he stayed motionless, his axe hovering in the air. The doll's face contorted in surprise, and his charge halted at the same moment. His mouth opened wide and he started to spew words in a hiss. "Please, could you send me?" Kyron was so filled with awe that he couldn't move. He slowly put the axe back in its sheath. "If I terminate Elizabeth's magical workings, your soul can be freed. There is no requirement for you to die if you are aware of this." It was the first time he had ever seen a doll so motionless. Its broken limbs hung limply, while its face was twisted in thought. "How are you?" Kyron bit his lip, eyes locked on the moon. He felt the magic emanating from his heart, binding him to the night sky. "I will stop my heart from beating." Kyron peered down into the darkness, but found no trace of the awakened doll. He wondered if it had been an apparition. Still, he kept a firm grip on his courage, knowing that no matter what his psyche was enduring, his will to be a hero remained unshakable. He spun back around towards the royal castle and took off running. Kyron reached the door to the royal chambers and stopped for a moment to catch his breath. The loud footsteps of the approaching dolls echoed in the night, seemingly louder than Kyron's own pounding heart. They would not rest until they found him. He steadied himself, taking in a deep breath of the night air, before using a single kick to splinter the door. He then rushed to the king's chamber, determined not to lose his composure. This mission was only for Elizabeth. Kyron stepped into the room, his sword in one hand and his helmet in the other. He was met with darkness, but the moon shone brightly, casting a spotlight upon him. Boulders and chunks of the ceiling lay scattered throughout the room, covered in a thick, sticky red. Limbs were strewn about, but they were not the type of limbs belonging to dolls. Kyron squatted down to examine the bodies more closely. One woman in particular caught his eye. Her half-crushed head, frozen in fear in her final moments, was unmistakable. Her white and gold robes shone against her pale skin, the color only partially obscured by the blood. Around her were similarly dressed people, the robes of the king's maids. They were never meant to be in this position. They would be willing to forgive me, and this is all that I need. The entire room seemed to come to life as a deep purple hue glowed from the walls and spread across the rugs. Kyron was startled when he heard a loud laugh, and his heart thumped as he took a deep breath. It was her. "It has been a long while since I last saw you, Kyron Doone. I have truly missed you." Elizabeth descended from the darkness above, her body giving off a gentle iridescent glow. Vibrant colors enveloped the room and Kyron's armor, turning the silver a violet hue. Elizabeth had cast a powerful spell, rendering Kyron unable to move his limbs. The intense energy expended on the journey had drained Kyron's strength. while Elizabeth's sweet voice echoed in his head and throughout the room. "You are truly heroic. My heart is full of admiration for you." Kyron was filled with anger, his fury overwhelming him. "I understand what happened between us, and I'm here to put an end to this hurt." Elizabeth hovered close to Kyron's face, her body glowing with a deep purple light. "It appears that your mental fortitude has grown significantly during your period of solitude. My charms have had no effect on you this evening. My determination is too firm for you to manipulate me again. I am determined to fulfill my obligations. I believe that if I caused you distress, you would become vulnerable. Instead, I have only witnessed your strength and courage. You really are something special." As long as Kyron was held back by her magic, he was unable to grab his axe. She was within his grasp, signaling the completion of his mission and his redemption. The potential of a man with such strength and power should not go to waste. That is why you were chosen. Give yourself over to me. Your beauty is too great to be relegated to that of a mere doll. Under no circumstances should you attempt to sell securities before their time. "Very well, Mr. Hero." Elizabeth pressed her lips gently against Kyron's cheek, then stepped away from him, her movements almost seeming to float. "It appears that I will have to." Kyron was met with the stench of death as soon as he and Elizabeth entered the room. A cacophony of thrashing and piling bodies surrounded them, resembling an avalanche. As Kyron steeled himself, he felt an otherworldly sense of peace. He was prepared to accept his fate, confident that he had done all he could. He had not given up his courage. He was the hero Sanaq had been waiting for. Elizabeth let out a gut-wrenching scream before Kyron had a chance to react. He opened his eyes to find a doll hovering in midair and sinking its teeth into her face, gnawing at her jaw tendons. Another doll jumped on her, and she was no longer able to maintain control of her magical powers. She fell to the ground, and more dolls quickly surrounded her and began tearing her flesh apart, their movements flinging droplets of blood all around them. Kyron felt the purple glow recede from his armor, and the night slowly grew darker. Elizabeth had fallen silent. He flexed his fingers and watched as the dolls began to fade away, turning into wisps of smoke that floated up into the air. "Thank you very much." The doll, awakened from the training grounds, was now standing behind him. Just like everyone else in the town, his body had been freed from the powerful dark magic. His soul was at last returning to its place of peace and rest. Kyron collapsed to the ground, gritting his teeth as the agony from his injuries surged through him. Exhaustion overwhelmed him, and he landed on the hard stone floor with a thud. "This is enough." Kyron knelt in the darkness, his gaze fixed upon Elizabeth's slaughtered body. Her heart had been violently ripped from her chest. He felt a wave of relief that it hadn't been him who had done this. Revenge was never his motivation. The captain's words echoed in Kyron's mind, and he smiled, despite the darkness around him. A single tear slid down his cheek.